Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to a Friday edition of yet another Inside Coach Masterclass conversation. Today, taking it back to an education for both players and coaches. We're delighted to have Mr. Matt Briggs joining us. So Matt is the head of academy recruitment out at Real Salt Lake, so one of the professional MLS programs. So absolutely delighted to be able to welcome Matt, and he's going to be able to give a bit of an introduction to himself and his background in the game, and why obviously we're so fortunate to be able to welcome him today. He's going to do that momentarily. Obviously, I have Mr. Mark Wilson alongside me, Tom Shields. So the way that this is going to work for the benefit of the players and coaches listening, myself and Mark will go through probably 40 minutes worth of questions and conversation with Matt, and then players, specifically turning it to you, we'll open the floor for a couple of questions from you guys. So please get thinking, those of us that are joining live, please start to think a little bit about some of the insight that you might want to receive. Obviously, it's not every day you get to speak to somebody working inside one of the professional academy programs. So please take every opportunity that you can to get as much out of Matt as possible. His insight is an incredible one. So Matt, obviously, thank you for being here. Just a quick shout out, players and coaches. Again, we're reaching the end of week number 2 with our Beyond Pulse Active Minutes project. So for the players that are looking for ways to own their lockdown, to demonstrate to their coaches how hard they're working during this lockdown season to continue to excel and get better and acquire new skills, please check out www.beyondpulse.com for more information about how you can join in all the fun with us there. But Matt, as we said, turning it back to you, thank you so much for sharing your Friday with us. Obviously, I'm delighted that you can be here, but for the benefit of everybody that's listening, if you could, a whistle-stop tour of what's been obviously a quite remarkable journey, and how did you end up on the opposite side of the country and obviously thousands of miles away from home? So please feel free to take it away, bud.
Well, thank you very much for having me and inviting me on. I'm looking forward to it, even though I'm a little bit nervous, but really looking forward to this. I moved over here when I was 20, came over actually originally coaching for a company like many of us probably for British Soccer, Challenger Sports. Got offered a scholarship, so played out here for 4 years, became an assistant coach at the college that I finished up with. Became the head coach there, had 9 seasons as a head coach, moved to Kansas City, 2 years in the Women's Professional League, moved back to Nebraska as a director of coaching, and then was a Division 1 coach on the men's soccer side with University of Nebraska Omaha, and then just got offered this position in January with Real Salt Lake. A close friend of mine and sort of mentor, Tom Spall, who was working for Double Pass, which was the company auditing MLS clubs. He was offered the academy director position. So then once he got in there, he offered me the position to join Real Salt Lake and their academy, which again, I started in January. So that's it in a whistle stop.
Very much so. Yeah, so Matt, obviously what we're going to dive into today is the world of recruitment, scouting, kind of player identification, talent development. So obviously in your position right now, you are responsible for casting your eye over lots of aspirational young soccer players and trying to establish whether or not they may have the skills, attributes, qualities, character necessary to make a career in the game. Obviously, myself and Mark have been fortunate with the amount of people and the caliber of people that we've been fortunate to speak to over the last few weeks and months that have all dived into various characteristics that they consider important. But I think this conversation, my hope is that the players on the line, it starts to broaden your understanding of what people are looking for and the importance of specific characteristics or attributes, mentalities that maybe some of you perhaps overlook. So Matt, we're going to start here. The last few months, I've swayed away recently from naming true five-a-side teams, but we were looking at factors of inspiration and perhaps people that had inspired others to grow and develop. And we obviously in soccer, we based it around five-a-side teams. For you, however, I'm just going to ask this. just on personal kind of preference or beliefs, is it possible for you to try to list or name 5 attributes or qualities that you believe underpin the brightest players, and perhaps things that the young players might not necessarily think about as immediately important? So broad question, take it anywhere that you like, but just curious as to your thoughts there.
I think this was a hard question for me to answer, and I don't think it's possible for me to nail down 5 attributes that the brightest players have across the spectrum. It's not possible. I believe each individual will have their own attributes, their strongest attributes, and areas that they need to grow in. I think different playing positions will have the attributes they potentially need. Different playing styles will demand different attributes, and then perhaps as you get further on in the game, the state of the game and where you are, winning, losing, or whatever that might be, will require those different attributes to come out. So I would also say there's no 2 players that are exactly the same. So just my opinion, it doesn't mean it's right, but my opinion is it's hard to identify 5 key attributes. I will say though, so from my time in Kansas City, I was lucky to work with Becky Sauerbrunn and Jarl Eberbusch, 2 centre backs, 2 wonderful players with completely different attributes as centre backs, but both playing professionally and both have represented their national team. But they had one main attribute in common, and I'll come on to that in a second. But when we're analysing players or evaluating players with Real Salt Lake, we look at them through all 4 phases of the game, whether they're attacking, whether they're defending, in those transitional moments between the 2. And then we look at them through the 4 corner model, so technically, tactically, psychosocial and physical. And if I go back to player specific, obviously a centre back might have different attributes to a central midfield player to a centre forward. So if I'm looking at a centre back, I might have a look at it while they're attacking. Do they have the ability to break lines, whether it's on a pass or a dribble, and what's their range of passing like? So we know that would be a technical thing. Perhaps when are they doing it? That might be a tactical decision. When we're defending, what's their 1v1 defending like? That could be on the ground, that could be in the air. So that's technically, that's physically. What shoulders they're marking on and the distances that they're putting between themselves, their opponents and their teammates, that's tactical, that's physical. When we transition from attack to defence, have they put action plans in place for what if we turn the ball over? Is that a tactical and sort of a technical thing? Do we try and regain immediately, or do we drop and deny space again? So I think you can go through all 4 phases, and you can go through all 4 moments of the 4 corner model, and try and develop attributes there. The one thing for me is the coach must be certain of those attributes they're trying to develop in the player, and the player must be certain of those attributes that they're trying to be developed in. Or frustrations will occur because players will potentially underperform, or coaches or players won't hit the expectations of the coach, or won't show an understanding of that. So, but I'll just go on to the one attribute, and it's probably no surprise to anyone, but I was reading Bill Beswick's book, and it's Focus for Soccer, and he said there's 3 types of players. There's players who are considered the gods. They have great ability and great attitude. There's those that have great ability and poor attitude, and there's those that have less ability and great attitude. And all the best players that I've worked with, and all the best players that maximize potential, have got the best attitude. So that would be the one that I would hang the hat on. But to sort of identify another 4 that I think we should really nail down is, I think, is tough.
I definitely agree. It's tough, mate. And the depth of insight already that you kind of you touched upon there from a using perhaps centre backs as an example was great. And I think I'm going to ask possibly if you could extend that just a little generically through other areas of the field. So maybe what's the centre midfielder doing it, just as a kind of a broader overview, because I think that that understanding, that specificity of attention to detail that you're looking at within games is things that might be missed or overlooked by the younger players, right? They might not be consciously aware of them doing or not doing those things. So I just think if there's a couple of other examples like the ones you've given, Matt, it would be brilliant. Not asking you to run through a full 11 positions, but a couple off the top of your head would be fantastic.
So, well, again, I think that it's not, I will and I can. I think it's, and if there's coaches on this, I think it's important that the coaches have a clear understanding of this, and then are able to portray that in a way to the players that they understand, because not every player learns the same way. So we as coaches have to learn how players learn and teach in that manner, but we have to have a clear understanding of what we're trying to teach. But for example, like a central midfield player, if we're attacking, we're looking at their receiving skills and passing range of passing skills. But I'll just sort of go here, there's a central midfield player we're looking at the moment whose passing retention is poor, but his regain ability is fantastic. So now we're looking at, well, this attribute of his passing isn't great. Can we develop that? But he's got this super strength of his ability to regain and get the ball back. So perhaps he's a central midfield player that's only a 5 to 25 yard passer of the football, and that's what he's in team for, and that's what his strengths are. But then he's about regaining the football for us. So anyway, carrying on sort of generically, passing and receiving skills definitely for your central midfield player. Technically, you're going down, and physically, you're looking at body shape to receive. Tactically, you're looking at where are they receiving. So do I drop behind or in front of the press to receive, to create an overload there? Are my centre backs comfortable on the football? Can they break lines, and can I start behind the press maybe? You're looking at awareness, so body shape, scanning the field. Do I play early and quickly, or do we maintain and build? Looking at physically, and you can be small as a player, you know that, but if you're going to be small, you have to be quick as well. You can't be. I think it's tough to really play at the highest level if you're small and you're not quick. So, sort of 3 attributes we're looking across the board are you technical, and that's through the positions. Are you quick, and are you the hardest worker in the room? I guess I'm kind of rambling here a little bit, but
I think that's brilliant, and I know I threw you a curveball there, so I apologise. But again, I hope players start to think again, as I said at the start of the conversation, anything that Matt speaks about that you might want a little bit more clarity on. If there's a position that you play that Matt's mentioned that you might want some advice or someone some guidance on, then obviously please just pop a message in and we'll turn our attention to it. Willow, I'm going to come straight to you now, just based on one of the names that Matt mentioned, and obviously Bill and your history with him as a professional footballer, but specifically Matt, what you spoke about in terms of players and those 3 tiers, and Mark, I just don't know if you could potentially speak to the players listening after a 16-year professional career of the fact that it wasn't always the most able players that sustained careers. It wasn't always if ever just simply the most technically gifted. The blend that Matt has spoken about in terms of yes, you've got to be technically sound, but the mentality and the character piece of it, and how important that is in terms of going on to have a career in the game. If you could, I'm going to open it to you straight away.
I think the way Matt started, I love that he's got a very open-minded, progressive approach to what you're looking for. If you start to put players in boxes and pigeonhole your own thoughts, and you create a bias, and that can be very dangerous when you're looking to recruit players. And then you mentioned somebody there, Matt, in Bill Bezic, who had a huge impact on my career. I first came across him at Manchester United, and he just joined as I'd snapped my Achilles, trying to make my way into the first team, and after playing a couple of games, and he helped me through a really difficult spell. And then I had the good fortune to work with him again at Middlesbrough for about 4 years. And everything you're talking about, Matt, even if you're looking at the 4-corner model, and this is just in my opinion, it's all linked to the psychological piece, because before we do anything, there's an emotion attached to a circumstance or a situation or context, and then there's a decision to be made, and then there's action to be taken. And I think when you look at the physical, tactical, technical corners, all of the actions are linked to that first psychological piece. So I think that's a key area that I've been fortunate to work with some really incredible people on developing that psychological approach to performance, to habit forming, to building better behaviors. And I went through a spell in my early career where, and this is being very candid and very honest for players on the line listening, when I when I stopped progressing forward and when I stopped getting into first team squads, or I was in and out and up and down performance wise, instead of pointing a finger at myself first and critiquing myself and becoming self-aware of my own performance, I tended to have discussions with coaches and managers that related to me pointing a finger at anybody but myself, and that became detrimental for me. It wasn't until my mid-20s that I managed to mature and find a balance and understand that whenever I'm underperforming, the first player I should look at, or whenever I'm not in a first team squad, the first person I should look at is myself. So there's a key piece psychologically in developing a positive attitude. I think that generates and creates a really healthy mental energy that you can apply to everything you do. But again, Tom, we're going back to, don't confuse simple with easy. The simplest things to do, in my opinion, or the simplest concepts and ideas, are some of the hardest things to do day in, day out.
I like what you said, that you sort of talked about not blaming, you blamed everyone else other than yourself. And I think as coaches, we have a tendency to do that. And I think we have to start with ourselves. So have we prepared the players properly? Have we set realistic expectations? Have we set, do we know what our KPIs are, and perhaps do the players, and do we gauge success on that rather than winning and losing? And I think coaches get too emotional, can do. And then they want to start pointing fingers rather than taking 5 minutes to have a look at themselves, which we're in youth development. We're not in the business of winning games here. We're in youth development, and it's a longer process. And I think we can be more reflective as coaches and encourage our players to be more reflective, so we can develop a long-term plan to maximise potential.
Yep, absolutely. And I think you both make really key and interesting points, and certainly to the players, if you've heard Matt speak about, you know, the importance of that psychosocial piece, you guys be accountable and be responsible for your attitude and behavior, and, you know, be the hardest working guy or girl in the room, because it goes an awful long way. Matt, I'm going to move on. So I'd like you to speak to the players, and I think for you've got a unique perspective of obviously being involved in the professional women's game, the high level collegiate game here, and obviously now in the kind of professional development phase, youth development phase at a pro club. So say in any of those walks of life, you've identified the player that breaks lines in possession, that tries to receive behind a press, that can play off 2 feet, that stands out to you with his or her ability, you know, to play the game. Can you talk about the process you then go through to learn more about that? I'd like you, if you could, to stress the importance of coachability or personality, you know, the importance of them being a good teammate, because again, I think sometimes perhaps young players are guilty of overlooking the importance of that side of the game, and think that, as we said before, simply talent alone will be enough. So could you speak to the depths that you go to currently and may have gone to in the past to broaden your knowledge on whom a player may be?
Yeah, of course. I think we're fighting society a little bit, where it's quite a narcissistic society, isn't it? And people are starting to be, and people are putting themselves in front of the team. So you've hit the points there. But the first thing we look at is we've obviously identified a player, and they've got certain qualities, key qualities that we're looking for. So we'll contact the club and the coach and ask for permission, or we'll state where we've watched the player, and then try and get some more feedback and insight on both the player and the family. And then sort of after this discussion, we would then ask for permission for the player to come in and train with our academy for at least a week. And there they'll be fully integrated into our training week, so we've got a residential program, so they'd be partnered up with a player, similar age group or position. They would shadow that player in the dorms, in the school, and then obviously at training. And we can evaluate them. We've already evaluated them to a certain extent as a player. Now we get to compare like for like, because we're comparing against current players in our academy. But probably the biggest piece we're looking at is what are their behaviours like in the classroom, what are their behaviours like in the dorms. Like the All Blacks have the saying, better people make better All Blacks, and we believe the same here. Better people make better players and will in turn maximise their potential because they'll have that inner desire too. So we're looking at the person more than just the player, taking a holistic approach to player identification as well. We get feedback from all the coaching staff on the player once they're in, but we also get feedback from their peers.
And what might that feedback be around, Matt? Like, can you just kind of share maybe some of the kind of questions or talking points that will come up in those conversations? Like, what information specifically are you looking to attain?
Yeah, so again, we go off the four corner model. So everything's based off that when we're evaluating a player is how have they done in each four corners. But they're going to have a certain level technically and tactically. That's their hardware. We know that, or they wouldn't have been invited in. Now, are they better than what we have, and do they have a pathway, or are they blocking a pathway? So I'll talk a little bit about that. Let's say, just for example, we've got an under 17 left back we're trialing. We might have an under 15 that's fantastic. So now the decision is, well, do we bring the under 17 in and potentially block the pathway for the 15? Do we play the 15 across an age group in the under 17s and identify another under 15 that potentially we've got 4 years to work with? So sometimes when we're having discussions, it's not just about the quality of the player, it's about the quality of the players in the group around them, above and perhaps below. And is there a clear pathway for them to progress, or would they be blocking the one? So they're things we're looking at as well. But obviously, sorry, go on.
Go ahead, mate. Go ahead. Finish what you were saying.
Yes, they've got a certain tactical, technical ability. We know that, but then and physical. But what are they like? And as we discussed earlier, what are they like as a person? What are they like academically? How are they in the classroom? How are they interacting with teammates? And we can really get that insight from the people that they're with. That's why it's so important to have them in on trial for us, because anyone can act really well for 2 or 3 days, but perhaps true colours start coming out over 4, 5, 6, 7 days.
And why? Just building on that point, Matt. Why is it so important that you know their quality as a teammate? You know whether or not they're committed in the classroom. Like, why are those things important to you from a coaching perspective, from a club perspective? Because the players can say, well, that's not me as a soccer player, right? Like, that's got nothing to do with me on the grass. So I don't know if you can just speak to, the importance of whether it's consistent character or the types of people that you want in the environment, and the players understanding that they have to demonstrate that all the time, not just some of the time, right? We don't want just good people on the soccer field.
Yeah, so one, it's a reputation thing. They're representing us, so we want them to represent the core values and belief that we have as an academy and as a club. 2, it's a safety thing. We've got 60 plus 18 and under year olds living under our roof, and we're basically their parent guardians. 3, we've got a responsibility as coaches to develop them as people and make sure they're in a safe environment with other like-minded people. And we know that if you're committed off the pitch and you're disciplined off the pitch, you're going to maximise potential on the pitch, or you've got a better chance of doing that. If you're not a great person, or you're not striving to be a great person, then you're taking your attention away from maximising potential on the pitch, and then potentially you're dragging other people into that group. And now we've got, maybe instead of 1 or 2 people that aren't maximising, maybe we've got 5, 6, 7 that aren't. So it's all about creating a culture. And while we understand that everybody and every player's got areas of growth, and it could be in any of the 4 corners, and we're willing to work with any player in that area of growth, technically, tactically, psychologically, physically, socially, whatever it may be, we'll give you longer to work on your technical, tactical, but if you've got disciplinary issues, then we can't afford that time, because you're causing issues for others in the group as well.
I think that's a brilliant point, and it's one that's, again, just speaking directly to the players now, and perhaps the coaches, with what you can reinforce within your environments. You know, you're hearing it from the horse's mouth, which I think is super important sometimes for players. Your club coaches aren't just saying this, and as we've touched upon, you know, Matt has worn the hat of women's professional coach and Division 1 men's coach, and you know, it's exactly the same in those environments. So please don't just think that this is simply a conversation about Real Salt Lake. You know, it is, but it isn't. And the same types of approaches are critical across all the levels. Matt, I do just want to kind of touch back on the concept of blocking pathways, because again, I think whether it's into an elite, you know, an elite youth club or professional club, or again, collegiately or professionally, you know, Willow, you speak about the 20-year-old that might be breaking through in the pro game, taking my place as a, you know, late 20, early 30s. Players, you have to understand, obviously, that across each of those levels, it's not being just the best at your age group sometimes won't be enough, but the best in your team sometimes won't be enough. The breadth of comparison that these programs, the highest level programs, go through is significant. So I think it's a really interesting point just for them to be conscious of thinking about. Okay, so we've spoken, you know, if they get through that kind of period where you're assessing them as people, you think they're a good fit. Maybe speaking more to now the caliber of games that you see at the youth level, day in, day out, week in, week out. Could you speak to some technical non-negotiables that players really should be conscious of trying to develop, and, you know, whether it's a super strength that separates the good from the great, or just simply, you know, baseline attributes that in order to play the game at the level that you're working at daily, you know, they really need to be focusing on. You obviously mentioned already a range of pass and perhaps being two-footed. I don't know if you can extend that a little bit more.
Yeah, I'll touch on the non-negotiables we have as an academy as a whole. So we talk about an holistic triangle within our academy, and at the tips of the points of the triangle, there's soccer, there's the dorm life, and then there's school. And we want players to strive to be A-grade students in all three areas, and push themselves. Not everyone's an A-grade student academically. Not everyone. We all make mistakes with teenage boys, and we'd be lying if we said we didn't make mistakes as sort of teenagers. So, but striving to be A-grade, they're non-negotiables. And if you're not striving to be that, then you'll be released from our academy. It's that simple. Again, the technical proficiencies are all position specific, I think. So your centre forwards technical proficiencies might be what's your hold up and link up play like, what's your finishing around the box like, so and off either foot. But then I'll sort of go off that. Chris Garcia's just signed a professional contract with us. He's predominantly right-footed, likes to play on the left so he can drift inside and work the keeper or combine. And a thing of us is, well, can you continue to work on your left foot? But if he can shape it with the outside of his right foot, and he can complete the same quality of, he can have the same execution, but it's outside of the right foot, does he need to work on his left? That's perhaps a philosophical thing for coaches, and that's perhaps an understanding of what players' key qualities are. So, but sort of nuts and bolts, we'd expect players to be competent playing off both sides over 5 to 20 yards. We're not expecting players to be able to zing balls 70 yards with both feet. We'd expect players are comfortable and competent 1v1 defending. We'd expect players that are comfortable opening out with pressure and without pressure, and using escape moves maybe in 1v1 situations to escape pressure. And we'd expect players to be able to go and beat players 1v1 on a dribbling move rather than checking out, but beating players 1v1. And I think that's for centre-backs as well. Centre-backs need to be able to carry the ball into midfield and create overloads the same way as a wide midfield player needs to be able to take his fullback on, or her fullback on.
So with that said then, Matt, let's go into, you know, you spoke just offline before we went live and started to record about the concept of individual development plans, and obviously, you know, your perspective position-specific relevance and position-specific attributes is obviously the next level of thinking, because the game is not just as simple as, you know, like you said, necessarily nuts and bolts. You've got to be able to execute on the different demands in different areas based upon, you know, different positions that you're playing in. If you could speak a little bit to, guys, can we just make sure that if you are, it's just our webcams that are on? Just see, maybe Cristiano, I think it's you. If we can keep that off, please. Thank you. So if you could speak to Matt, you know, maybe first and foremost what an individual development plan is, how coaches and players can work together to, you know, to create them, and then I'd like to touch upon specifically with the stage of, you know, the stage that we're in right now as a country, or as a world, I guess, about lockdown, how you can maybe couple both of those things with turning strengths into super strengths. Obviously, you've kind of referenced that concept a little bit earlier in the conversation. So let's go, you know, IDPs and the role that coaches and players play together first, and then how can they maximize training at home to really build on those skills?
Yeah, so hopefully this will come full circle, and if we can help develop IDPs, then we can help develop the 5 key attributes of each player specifically, and it will bring us full circle to the first question. So an individual development plan is basically that. You and me might be 2 centre backs, but we've got different qualities and different areas of strength and different areas of weakness that we need to develop. I think if we really take a holistic approach to this, part of people involved in a player's development are 1, the player, 2, the player's teammates, 3, the coach, and 4, the parents. And we need to get everybody sort of involved in that. But the most powerful and the strongest way, I feel, for a player to develop is for them to take ownership of their own development. As coaches, we need to inspire that. And it can't be us just saying, hey, Tom, you must work on this, because perhaps I don't believe it, or perhaps I don't feel it, that that's something I need to work on. So now I haven't taken ownership in it, and I'm potentially not going to put the same effort or maximize the effort in there. So I think as coaches, we need to inspire our players. That's the biggest thing. And we need to look at what they can do, not what they can't do. We need to identify what their super strengths are, or they need to identify, or we're part of that process. What are their super strengths? What gets them in the team? And then what are their weaknesses that could potentially keep them out of the team? And they would form an individual development plan. And I think so. Part of maximizing players' development and individual development within a team concept, like we're fortunate within Real Salt Lake that it isn't about wins and losses for us. Like a win is getting a player into the first team or getting them a professional contract with the Monarchs or with the MLS. And I think sometimes in club soccer we're not that fortunate, because we've potentially feel the pressure of having to win games to satisfy adults' desires to win games, parents in particular. So we're fortunate that we can perhaps take a longer approach and focus on individual development and individual learning objectives within a game, rather than the outcome of do we win or lose. So having said that, though, I think that if you look at it, and people don't care how much you know until they know you care. That's Theodore Roosevelt. And I think this is a really important time for us as a community and as a society to pull together. And I think the strongest way as coaches, we can help develop individual development plans with players. And perhaps the conversation isn't about what are they like as a soccer player at the moment. Perhaps the conversation is, how are they doing as a person? And perhaps the conversation is, why do they play soccer? Now, for us, we presume our MLS players are in the academy are playing soccer because they want to be pros. So then it's fair to assume that they should be training every day. But perhaps a player's reason for playing soccer is because it's a social element, it's a fitness element, it's because I would like to play high school and has no decision or desire to play college, then your expectations of a coach of the amount they should be practicing at home are completely different, I think. So perhaps moving forward, the conversation should be about the person more than the player. And when the player knows that we care about them, and sort of you talked a little bit on this, Mark, about that emotional connection, then maybe we can start really digging deeper into what does that player want to achieve and how can we help facilitate that learning. So anyway, with the individual development plans, it would be, I think as a club, it would be quite clever to identify players that have similar learning needs and putting them together, like I said, and maybe instead of as a club, you have a generic Zoom meeting where you're all doing certain cover footwork, which there's no problems with that. But wouldn't it be more powerful if all three of us were on a Zoom and we were working on ball striking, and you showed me your ball striking, we evaluated it as peers, and as a coach, we went back and tried to implement what we evaluated, and then perhaps together we can find success that way. Then maybe that again, that's hitting that social component of which we're lacking at the moment, considering we're FaceTiming and WhatsApping and social distancing and Zooming. We're not actually feeling each other. Perhaps that's a way that we could do it.
It's a great idea. It's definitely something for people to consider for sure. Just if you, I mean, you mentioned there managing expectations, Matt, and your point of if you've got the boys in your academy that are claiming that they aspire to be professionals, or you're assuming that that's their aspiration, that really it's an everyday thing right now. Can you speak to the importance of, regardless of level, the importance of making sure that you're actively doing something during this period of time, so that when you do return to the field, obviously you're as ready and able to be successful and handle the demands of the game as possible. And maybe if you're a player who wants to overtake their teammates, just the impact of aggregated training. And if Mark does 4 sessions a week for 8 weeks and you do 2 and I do 1, who you would assume to come out kind of on top, and why that might be important. So
well, I think let me just go back a little bit. I think we've got to, again, as coaches, understand what each player's training environment is like, and perhaps that's also down to what each player's financial situation is like and where they are logistically. So if we've got players that are from all over the country, and some are in San Diego that perhaps can't get out, for instance, or some are in San Diego but have really affluent families, have got a massive backyard. Well, perhaps some are in a different part of the country but are low income and having to work for their parents in construction maybe. So I think as coaches, we've got to understand what their home environment is like for each player before we start putting demands on they should be doing X, Y, and Z. So it's the what and it's the why to begin with. But yes, you're right. If players are maximizing their time, if possible, by developing an IDP and working on areas of strengths and weaknesses, and doing that 5 times a week of high intensity, so it's deliberate practice of high intensity, then yes, they will, you would imagine, would supersede those that aren't. But it's I think it's unfair for coaches to put their expectations on what players should be doing, because if they don't align, then there's going to be issues. So players have to determine what they want to be doing and what they feel is going to be successful for them. And all we can do as coaches is help facilitate that. Yes, we want every player to be that God that Bill Beswick talked about: good attitude, good ability, and wants to train like Roy Keane or an animal every day. But as you know, I think it's quite tough psychologically being in this state, considering the coronavirus, and it's quite tough to get motivation to go and train and work every day to your maximum. So that's where that emotional connection comes in, I think, from the coach, and hopefully inspiring the player then to go and do that. And that's where we have to be understanding as coaches that yes, we want you to train, and yes, we expect you to train if you want to reach these levels. But perhaps it's identifying what the levels are first before we go and say you should be doing X amount of sessions a week.
Yeah, very fair. Very fair, very interesting. Great perspective to share there. Players, I'm going to speak directly to you guys now. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask Matt, the chat function, the messaging function at the top of the screen. I'm going to ask one more question, Matt, just to maybe buy some time for these guys, the audience, to think of a question or two. But my question to you is, can you tell us a story about an aha moment? Like, you spotted a kid, what's the most memorable time where you kind of, a kid stood out to you? What was it they were doing? Just to kind of paint an example from that perspective.
Do you know what? This is going to sound really silly, but like when we're looking at not just good players, we've talked about it, and it's sort of been the theme: good people. So we live in the dorms in Rio Salt Lake, and my wife and two young children are live in the dorms at the ground level with us. So there's my little son. He's 18 months and he's out and about running around. And one of the trialists asked if he could pick him up. Yeah, no problem. For me, that shows that this is actually a good person and a caring person. Didn't just bowl by my kid and knock him over because he was in a hurry. And again, so this is just my opinion. It doesn't mean it's right, and certainly not. I can't sort of alluded to Roy Keane. Would Roy Keane have done that as a young player? No, so it's not. That doesn't mean that's right for every player, and it's not fair for me to paint my brush on every player and say you should be doing this and asking if you can pick my child up. But for me, that just confirmed, yeah, this is a good kid and someone we should spend extra time with. Other aha moments in the negative, you look at players, how they act when they've conceded a goal or when they've lost or when they've been substituted, and that goes, perhaps that's not a player we'll continue to follow or will follow with less fervour because they've displayed poor attitude. So it isn't always what they're doing on the pitch. It isn't that he's or she's picked the ball up on the edge of the box, turned a player inside out and bent one in the top corner. It might be what are their actions like during the warm-up? Are they leading the warm-up?
And I think,
so,
look, I think that last one, Matt, especially on perhaps you have a player, you can be a collegiate coach, you can be an academy scout right now, players on their line with their youth clubs. This is something, that we reinforce all the time. You never know who's watching and you never know when they're watching. And ultimately, I don't want to scare people, but it might be that, Matt, if you see, a player who is, goofing around in the warm-up, not engaged, being disruptive or, a destructive influence, I would hazard a guess to say that's a one and done, and they don't get a second chance to make a first impression, right? So
no, you don't get a second chance to make a first impression. But then I think as adults we've got to find the why to why they were acting like that, and then perhaps we have to delve a little bit deeper into that. But no, like, first impressions are so important. You're right there, and there's definitely a correlation between good learners on the pitch and good learners off the pitch, and there's a correlation between good people who are driven and them reaching their goals and success rather than people with poor attitudes, not.
Perfect.
In the long term, I would say.
Well, I'm going to stop it being from me. We've had a few questions come in here from the coaches listening. So first one, and Andy, forgive me here, it's the best piece of advice Matt could offer coaches. I'm not sure if this is in terms of preparing players. I would take it that direction in terms of what can the coaches be doing in their everyday training environments to best prepare the players to come into an environment like yours and achieve success?
Drive intensity without really being the driver themselves. I think so. Like John Cohen from US Soccer says, training should look like soccer on steroids, and I agree with that. Like, training should be harder than the game, and Bill Beswick sort of alluded to, you train Monday to Friday, so Saturday's sort of easy. And I think the biggest thing when players come into our environment, they go, "Oh, this was quicker, this was faster, this was more physical." But how can you get the players driving the intensity? And it shouldn't be from you. And when I was younger as a coach, I thought it was from me screaming and shouting on the touchline, and that only gets a small return or a short-term return. So how can you drive intensity in competition to ensure that they're ready for that next part? A good mentor of mine from England, Ian White, said it should be soccer training or football training should be the most competitive playground in the world. And I really like that because it should be enjoyable. It's got to be enjoyable, but it's got to be competitive. So
I love that. I'm stealing that one.
it's yours.
Thank you, mate. Appreciate it. Okay, next one is Mr. Lawson asks, how important is it and what are the best techniques in finding a balance between what the current level possible potential and aspirations of a player are when opinions may differ between the coach, the player, and possibly the parents? So that's obviously an interesting triangle that you've got to try to overcome there. So maybe there's a little bit there on performance versus potential, you know, and making sure that aspirations and expectations are balanced. Can you speak to, you know, speak to some of the challenges?
That's really good. I would always start with the player and ask the player, what do they want to do? Like, what are their aspirations? And then I think we've got a policy, and we're 100% honest. So if you come in for a trial with Real Salt Lake, we're going to be honest with you. Yes, we think you're of the grade. These are the reasons why. No, we don't think you're of the grade. These are the reasons why. And you'll either be offered a contract or you won't. There's no grey areas. And is it hard? Is it a hard conversation? At the moment, yes. But in the long term, they're going to thank you for it, because you have to be honest and you have to say, this is what we perceive to be your pathway at the moment. So I would encourage, one, complete honesty from everybody involved, and two, I encourage the player to sort of discover what their chosen pathway is, because I know a lot of the time the adults put their pressure on the players. Now, if a player has got an unrealistic choice or pathway they're trying to take, you can't kill them right off by saying no, but you have to find a way to navigate and show them on a different path that might maybe at some point bring them to here. But
yeah, great. Go on.
Or if a player wants to trial with an MLS club, but clearly the adults can see that they or NWSL, wherever it may be, are not ready, then what action place are you putting in place or action steps are you putting in place for the player to potentially achieve that in the future, rather than just killing them off and saying, no, you're not good enough right now?
The segue into that question, I mentioned the phrase performance versus potential. And obviously, I think depending on the age group of some of the young players listening, there may be the early developer, athletically gifted, stronger, faster, and there may be the, you know, later birth date, maybe slightly smaller, maybe less physically able to execute skills or techniques at the same level. How do you judge the future prospects of perhaps the early maturer and where they will level out, and kind of what processes do you go through to try and make the most informed decisions about what their ceilings may be?
Yeah, it's a tough one because no one has a crystal ball, and we can't. It's sort of all guesswork, really, to a point. But I think when you're forming a team or recruiting players, you have to find a balance. You certainly can't have a team full of early developers, and you certainly can't have a team full of late developers. There's got to be a balance in there. What we're doing now is, I think, as coaches and people that are in player identification, they're starting to educate themselves a little bit on what maturation looks like and what signs we should be looking like, so you can have a ballpark figure of where this player is physically now and where might they be in 5 years versus this player. But we can't say, well, we're not going to take you because you're an early developer, and we can't say we're not going to take you because you're a late developer. I think it's about, like I said, finding that balance and looking at players. And you could be an early developer but technically horrendous, then we can't, then there's no real room for you. If you're technically good but a late developer, then you've probably got a better chance. So
is that, Matt, is there a minimum? So you've mentioned the four corners a lot about when you were selling players. Yeah. Is it is there a process at all where you're like, okay, 3 out of the 4 need to be a check, and then we make a best call on the 4th? Is it, hey, if 2 are super strengths, if they're really quick and technically strong, but perhaps they wander in games, they're not tactically disciplined, like if it's 2 out of 4, like is there any kind of process like that in place, or am I just...
Probably, no, you're right, and it would depend on the age groups. So if you're a under 19 and you've only got 2 out of 4 and you're way behind on the other 2, for instance, it's going to be hard to sign you because you've only got a smaller window to develop those other areas. I think, let me go back. Like the biggest thing that we're really obviously not the biggest thing. One of the biggest things we're looking at is when we identify players, it's actually their GPA, and because that tells us that they're actually quite good learners and good at studying. So we'll look at what is, like, just for instance, our 2006s we've got coming in have got a GPA of 3.757. Now, again, that doesn't mean that you're going to be a pro, and it doesn't mean if you've got a 1.5 GPA, you're not going to be a pro. What it does mean is that you're probably quite good at learning. And it probably shows that you've got discipline in the classroom, which we would hope transfer over onto the pitch.
Yeah, fascinating.
I would have been your 1.5,
yeah.
Sadly. I just want to make a point, or not make a point. When I think about measurables, so your KPIs for why a player checks a box, I think it's important for the player to understand that, good performances and poor performances leave clues. And if you're a midfielder and you like to receive the ball 20 to 25 times per half from your fullback, your centre back, and another player, if you put those types of measurables in place, it's much easier, I think, for the coach and for the player to know what progression is, to know what rhythm, flow, and success looks like for that player. And just staying on the same topic, but moving a little bit forward, I've been wanting to ask for most of the call, in terms of your recruitment process. Obviously, the first team end, I don't know whether it is context based, but it's like you don't recruit Benteke to play for Liverpool if you don't make crosses. That didn't happen. You don't recruit Gavi to play for a Tony Pulis team who only want 40% possession. So that's context based on their game model. When you come down to the 10s to probably 16s, 17s, I've spoken to a number of different MLS clubs and clubs back in England, and sometimes their recruitment policy is, we're looking for one super strength. We're looking for a kid who's got good movement mechanics, who can actually, strike the ball cleanly with his left foot 7 out of 10 times, because in that sense, if you bring that player in, the best way to get what you want as a club is to develop it, right? You're not recruiting already ready-made finished players. It's, we're going to develop them in line with our process and our club philosophy and methodology. So could you speak to that a little bit, Matt, in terms of process?
Yeah, so the first team are now driving how we should play as an academy, which will then, in turn, you would think, the type of players we recruit. Certainly at the top end. I still think at the 15s, and we've only got 15s, 17s, and 19s. At the 15s, we're probably looking for good, like, technical and quick players. And then we'll start working with them. If you're an 18 or a 19, you've got to fit the mold almost, because we're looking at, you're going to be a pro. We're not going to bring you in at 18 and 19 if we don't think you're going to be a pro, because we've already got players in that position playing, and why transfer like for like? It makes no sense. So I think at the 15s, and when we're looking at them at 14s, we're looking for good players, technically good players, quick players with a great attitude and desire to learn. Obviously, we're looking position specific, but we know at 15, if you're starting out as a centre back, you could move, or as a centre forward, you might move. So I just lost my train of thought a little bit there. I'm sorry. What was the last part you mentioned about processes? Were you talking about? I'm sorry.
Yeah, in terms of processes, you're having, obviously I think there's a duty of care to your players all the way through, from being a 10-year-old to whether you're a first team professional, right? And it's a lot of the discussions I'm having away from the field with certain clubs are that duty of care means there are different stakeholders in charge of different pieces of the development of that player. as they move through. But even if they get into the first team, you still shouldn't stop communicating. So in terms of your setup and process within RSL from youth level to senior level, senior pro level, how does that look? And do you all consistently communicate to help players through each phase?
Yeah, you're right. So we talk about moving across the age groups, not up and down. So we talk 15s moving across to 17s, moving across to 19s to hopefully Monarch's first team. We think that's a psychological piece. If you talk about moving players who've moved up and then moving them back down, that's quite a tough probably hurts them a little bit psychologically. We've got a technical committee at the club that discuss all players and the pathway of each player. And then certainly if players are now training across an age group and across with the first team or the Monarchs in the professional setting, we get feedback on those and how they're doing. And then the development of the IDPs in the academy is now actually transferring into the first team. And during this coronavirus epidemic, the players have been working on their IDPs. That's the only thing they could do. So development doesn't stop at 20 once you sign your professional contract. We know that. People might disagree, but development can continue if you've got a growth mindset and if you're willing to work at it. And it should continue if you want to maintain your contract in your professional career. What we're also doing, though, within the club, if you're a young player getting offered a professional contract, we're also, like you talked about, different departments. We're also looking at how we're helping you graduate high school and how we're helping you get into college. And are we helping cover expenses for college? Because a lot of the boys would have turned down a good scholarship, potentially, to come into the college or professional environment. And we know we can't put all of our eggs in one basket, that you're going to be a pro at 20, you're going to be a pro at 35 and retire on that. So how are we helping you? How are we helping you holistically, I guess?
That's another great point, Matt, and certainly something that I think is definitely so important when players are reaching those key decision-making ages. So last question from the audience. I'm conscious of the time. Andy asks, have you ever missed spotting a talented player? And if so, why? And what did it teach you? Great question, Andy.
A great question. Yes. And we do all the time. We miss because we're only getting a small sample size. And if you think the length and breadth of this country, it's really hard. And then you think as well, like in the MLS, we've got territories that we can only pick from, certain territories and certain time. We don't have a scouting network either. So it's myself. You think it in Europe that there'll be a scouting network, and European clubs will have scouts in America, and we'll have scouts in other countries, and we don't. So we're a little bit behind that. So yes, we've missed. At the end of each week, we'll have a collaborative meeting with the coaches, and coaches will agree or disagree on players, and that's the nature of it. Tom, our academy director, will have the final say, and it'll be a yes or it's a no. And if we say no, there's a chance they'll get snapped up by someone else. And if we say yes, we might have got it wrong that way, which then isn't good for the player and isn't good for our program. So I think the reason you miss is perhaps you haven't done due diligence, and you've been in a rush to make a decision. And 9 times out of 10, players will commit to you if they feel, and I'll bring it back to that emotional connection. So if I'm in a rush to sign you, Mark, and I offer you something right away, but I haven't actually done my due diligence on you as a player and as a person, perhaps it's more dangerous to miss on the end of making a mistake because he's not good enough or the right fit, rather than it is that we've missed and he's actually a really, really good player. Because that good player will probably go and find another club somewhere else.
Yeah, great answer, great points. Just gonna, I think, Matt, just conscious of your move back to work today, we'll wrap it there. That's an hour of great insight shared. So really appreciate you taking the time out of what's going to be a busy day for you to jump on and speak to the players and the coaches now, and as we said, always as well on demand. So thank you so much, buddy, for sharing that, players and coaches. I hope you found it useful and insightful. Just a quick one from us. Next week we go again. We're going to turn our attention heavily towards games-based approaches to coaching. But on Monday, we have a very special guest in Red Bull Salzburg, head coach Jesse Marsh. So Jesse is opening up the week for us, 12 o'clock Eastern. Really looking forward to that one, and hope you guys can be here for that. But Matt, again, on behalf of myself, Willow, and all of Team Beyond Pulse, thank you ever so much, buddy. Before I let you go, if you could speak to the players or the coaches, if they're interested in picking your brain a little bit more, how could they find you?
In a car for the next 15 hours driving to Utah. But first of all, thank you very much for having me on. Really appreciate it. Enjoyed it. So thank you very much. I think they could just send me an email. Do you want to share my email address with everyone? And if people have questions, they could just email me. I'm perfectly fine with that. Perfect.
Yeah, I'll do that once we follow up on the back end on social media. So yeah, great. Thank you, Matt, ever so much. And players and coaches, enjoy your weekends. And again, thanks as always for choosing Beyond Pulse as your daily dose of education.
Thank you.